Our next speaker is Bryan Tilt of Oregon State University. He's going to wrap up this early morning session with a talk about beyond fishing farms, identifying water management priorities after the Klamath Dam removals. And so welcome, Bryan. And as soon as you get your slides set up, please take it away. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Can people see my screen?
Yes, I can.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Yeah, so I'm an anthropologist. I'm a social scientist. I've been really interested over the years in trying to understand the kind of cultural values of different groups in the Klamath Basin and understand how those shape people's water management priorities, how they shape people's experience of dam removal and so forth. I'm going to take a snippet of that research and share that with you today. A shout out to our project team. We've been funded by Oregon Sea Grant over the last 4 years, partnered with the Yurok tribe, and I see at least, let's see, Mike and Christine and Laurel are on the call today. So a shout out to you all and the things that I've been able to learn from you over the years. I have to put a picture of our group wearing high-vis vests and hard hats because it's so rare for an anthropologist to don this kind of equipment. So it's been really interesting for me to visit some of these restoration sites, to see some of the biological and ecological research that's happening in the basin. So our division of labor on this project, spans from the biophysical and ecological to the sociocultural. So all the way from things like understanding sediment and algae and water quality to understanding, human values and different user groups in the basin. And as an anthropologist, I focus primarily on the latter, really focusing on these different groups in the basin. And of course, everyone on this call knows the history of strife and conflict and experiences around water scarcity and water allocation in the basin. And when you undertake something like this, it's kind of by necessity a reductive exercise. You have to take a whole lot of social and policy complexity and boil it down to some groups that you can get your hands around. So we focused on the perspectives of these 5 groups. Agriculture, so both farming and ranching, both on the Oregon side of the border and the California side of the border. Ocean fisheries, people who have experienced many years of salmon stock declines and are using various adaptive strategies, either, going into different species or some sort of shifting in and out of commercial fishing and charter fishing. Copco residents, we have a master's student right now whose focus is solely on the Copco area, understanding the perspectives of people in that community as they experience dam removal and river restoration. And you'd actually be surprised how sparse the literature is on the social impacts of dam removal. I had done a bunch of research prior to this on the social impacts of dam construction, primarily in an international context. And there's a lot of literature that looks at, how communities and families and regions change with dam construction and access to land and other resources. There's very little on dam removal. So that's been an interesting focus of ours. And then conservation, and this is kind of a big catch-all term, really focusing on different agencies and organizations that are working on water quality and habitat restoration and so forth. And then OSU has partnered with the Yurok tribe for the last 4 years on this project. And as my group has been conducting interviews and surveys with these groups around the basin, tribal researchers have also been conducting interviews and surveys, primarily with tribal elders, and asking questions similar to what we're asking about experiences of dam removal and water management priorities going forward, but also bringing a focus on traditional ecological knowledge and trying to understand the historical importance of fisheries and other resources for tribal members. So a big part of what we're focused on in the sociocultural part of this project is understanding people's values in relation to water. If you look at the history of conflict in the basin, a lot of it comes from different cultural identities and different values of the various user groups. And our methods have been kind of sequential. We started with kind of compiling a Klamath Basin event chronology, putting together actually a couple hundred different events over the last 150 years that have been significant in relation to water management, and those types of things. So if you're interested in, I've got a link to our website at the end of the presentation. If you're scratching your head at some point and going, oh, what year was that court case? Or what year was this species ESA listed? This event chronology is a great place to look at. And then phase two, which we're winding up now, has consisted of qualitative interviews with these various user groups. We've done, I think, over 100 so far, with a free listing exercise, and I'll explain what that is. And then as of now, we're just initiating phase three, the final phase, where we have a quantitative survey instrument. And the idea is to ask a series of ratings questions and agree, disagree questions, and then use a statistical technique called consensus analysis that kind of shows us where are the patterns of agreement and disagreement in perspectives across these user groups. So for today, I'm just going to narrow in on these two groups. When you hear in the media and in public discourse about conflict in the Klamath, they often reduce it to this kind of fish versus farms binary perspective. And of course, we all know that's far too simplistic. But these are the first two groups, the agriculture group and the conservation group, that we completed our qualitative interviews with. And it is really interesting to kind of dig into this data and compare the perspectives. So the agriculture group, we're talking about multi-generational farmers and ranchers in Klamath County, Oregon, and Siskiyou County, California. It was really interesting for me to hear Shubham's presentation from earlier this morning about irrigation curtailment in the Scott Valley. We actually have a lot of interviews in the Scott Valley with people talking about what it's been like to deal with curtailment. So a lot of synergy there. And then the conservation group, broadly, these are scientists and policy experts in state and federal agencies or nonprofit organizations that have some kind of mission focused on conservation and river restoration. It could be water quality, could be salmon, could be habitat restoration. And I know there are folks on this call who were actually interview participants. So I really appreciate people sharing their perspectives with us. The free listing exercise is something we often use in anthropology when we're trying to understand in broad terms how people think about a system. And so we asked, in each of our qualitative interviews, we asked this prompt. Government agencies and other organizations often need to make decisions about how to manage the river and related resources. For your group, whatever it is, what are some important management objectives? In other words, what should the Klamath Basin be managed for? And I've got kind of a couple things I want to share for the agriculture group and for the conservation group. One is just this frequency analysis that shows, all right, here are the top 5 management priorities that emerged from that question. And the other is some qualitative quotes from the interviews that helps to kind of flesh out exactly what people were talking about. One thing I'll point out right away is that for farmers and ranchers, they tended to focus a lot on kind of process. And this is really different from the people in the conservation group who focused more on outcomes, managing for different specific outcomes. Farmers and ranchers tended to talk a lot about management processes. So things like fair representation, data-informed decisions, community well-being, water storage and supply, and water and property rights. And I'll kind of unpack each of those a little bit with these quotes, these snippets from interviews. So one person in the agriculture group said, in regards to fair representation, someone regulating how much water is going down the ditch or down the river, that person needs to live here, needs to be part of our community. They need to get a paycheck from nature. So this kind of feeling that, people in Sacramento or Salem or Washington, D.C., don't have the level of vested interest that, say, locals do. And then data-informed decisions hinging around differences over how science is being utilized in practice. And of course, if you followed debates around, ESA, different biological opinions coming out, a lot of the conflict in the basin historically has been around the uses of science and the importance of science in regulatory processes. This idea of community well-being. So one person said, that's why when the conversation is you need to do without water, it's such a difficult conversation for farmers because that's everything. That's all there is. It's the house my family's lived in. It's the job I've done my whole life, the business I've been involved in my whole life. Everything is bound up into that one question. And then, of course, on the topic of water storage and supply, a lot of people talking about the seasonality of water and the increasing unpredictability of what the irrigation season is going to look like. So one person said everything's usually good until about the middle of July or sometime around then, depends on the year. And then the flows start going down, and then it gets to be real critical. A lot of people talking about water and property rights. And in fact, I think this person is from the Scott River Valley talking about their experience of curtailments. Our ranch here has the most senior water right. We're classed as one of the most senior in the state. And the California State Water Control Board curtailed us for the first time ever over the period of drought. This was summer 2023. So a lot of people talking about kind of being surprised by those curtailments and talking a little bit about how those curtailments affected their operations on the farm or on the ranch. Now, if we get into the conservation group, so conservation is kind of a broad term that really encompasses all of these different state and federal agencies and nonprofit organizations that focus somehow on a mission-driven objective in the basin. So here's the frequency distribution of their water management priorities. Restoration and conservation, and we'll dig into each one of these in the qualitative quotes about what they mean. Fish, responsible irrigation, river ecosystem health, and water quality. And again, these are more sort of outcomes related responses as opposed to the irrigators who tended to talk more about process. So with conservation and restoration, a lot of our respondents talked about things like process-based restoration, returning to messy wetland, sort of ecosystem services that are provided by wetlands. Fish is, of course, very reductive. We've got suckers in the upper basin that are endangered. We've got salmon in the lower basin, different species, different runs. A lot of people in the conservation group talked about salmon not in its own right, but as an indicator of overall ecosystem health. And most of these interviews were conducted before or during dam removal, so we weren't at the point where we were able to see some of the early salmon returns last fall and this fall. Responsible irrigation, people in the conservation group talked about successful management, meaning valuing the health of the whole. And that doesn't just mean fish, it means people too. So trying to link up community well-being with ecosystem well-being. And then thinking more broadly about river ecosystem health, people talking about interrelated problems like wildfire, for example, and the impacts on water quality, talking about land use change, and then talking about things like groundwater. The water table is so depleted that there's an underground drought, if you will. Some of that water is fossil water. You're not going to recharge it. It took thousands and thousands of years to build that up. And then people in the conservation group talked a lot about how water quality is connected to all these interrelated problems in the basin. Nutrient levels, sediment load, algal blooms, higher water temperatures, and all of these things, of course, historically contributing to salmon mortality. So a lot of differences in this kind of fish versus farms narrative, but also a lot of commonalities actually as we dig into the data on these two groups. Both of these groups talk a lot about uncertainty. So one agricultural producer said it's not so much about not having water, it's not knowing if you're going to have water. People talking about what is it like to, be told, especially on the Klamath irrigation project, be told by reclamation sort of what your expected irrigation delivery is in April, and then have that change throughout the season. And, in the meantime, you've made investments on your property and you've made plans based on deliveries that end up being changed. And of course, the conservation group talks a lot about future uncertainty as well, in the face of climate change and increased wildfire risk and so on. Both groups talked about the importance of intergroup collaboration and trust. So one person from the conservation group said, we need to show how the work that we're doing provides some benefit to the larger community. A lot of interviewees in the conservation group also talked about how, if they're doing stream monitoring activities, for example, and a lot of that work needs to take place on public land, they need to have relationships of trust with landowners just to get the science done. Both groups talked a lot about the importance of holistic landscape scale management. And it was actually interesting for our group to see that how much dissatisfaction there was across these groups with single species management approaches. Almost everybody, farmers, ranchers, people working in fish restoration, talk about, yeah, the ESA, is one way of approaching it, but it's also very reductionist and it doesn't address the kind of basin level challenges that we face. And then people thinking about, let's think outside the box before dam removal about flushing flows to improve water quality, maybe thinking creatively about water rights transfers, and some of the cropland to wetland conversion projects that are happening around the basin. So wrapping things up, we've got a PhD student focusing on coastal fishing communities and how they've been dealing with dam removal and restoration. We're now administering our survey. We're continuing our collaboration with the Yurok tribe. Probably after the meeting, with Randy's permission, I'll check in about the possibility of circulating a link to our survey, which you can also see here, and a QR code. Basically, if you are a scientist or a policy person in an organization with a conservation or restoration mandate, we invite you to participate in the survey, and that essentially allows us to compare the groups quantitatively in terms of their responses and run this consensus analysis and figure out, where are the points of divergence and convergence in the views of these different groups, and what are the implications of that for policy and for management going forward. So I'll leave it there, and thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Bryan. And really appreciate these links and the open end of your survey so people can participate and reach out to you. We don't really have any time for questions. We snuck into the break by a minute or two. So if you could please put your questions to Bryan in the chat. I want to thank all three speakers this morning and also the participants. I can see the chat's been really active over there with Maya's comments, and hope you stick around for the entire day. Thanks again.